Well, the 2016 election led to a major reckoning for the news media, big segments of which were blindsided by Donald Trump's victory. Now, as the dust settles on 2020, the angst-filled postmortems are beginning again, even though the lessons of this election still aren't entirely clear. Adam has more.
If you followed the polls and election models like 538, you might have thought Joe Biden would lock up a victory on election night. Obviously, that didn't happen.
How did the polls get it so wrong again?
How do you explain CNN having a 12-point margin for Joe Biden?
A lot of folks are waking up and saying, why were these seeming to be so off?
Maybe because shy Trump voters didn't want to go public with their preference. Also, depending on where you get your news, you might have assumed voters of color were all in on Biden. Instead, Latino support helped Trump win Florida and Texas and had the media playing catch-up.
So there's just so much diversity there within the Latino community.
And economics makes a difference, too?
Economics does make a difference.
Also puzzling the press, early signs that Trump gained with black voters.
91% of black women went for Biden. 80% of black men went for Biden.
Sexism and patriarchy isn't the possession of white men.
Of course, Biden also got plenty of black and Latino support. Still, there's an abiding sense that journalists still don't get Trump's appeal.
You have the media, such as yourself, going out there and poo-pooing it all, but, there's a lot of grassroots support out there.
But maybe, given what's changed from Tuesday to today, that's not the story we should be chasing anymore.
All right, Adam, what is the story we should be chasing?
Can I stall for time by making two other quick points and then suggesting the story? The first is that I am very sympathetic to pollsters because I'm not sure we've seen a candidate quite like Trump who might engender embarrassment or shame even among some of his staunch supporters. It'll be interesting to see down the road if this is a unique phenomenon to him, if he was sort of the glitch that threw off the polling industry, or if there's a bigger systemic problem at play here. As for the story, I'll try to accelerate to your question. If you imagine the timing on this being flipped, if we had learned about the late called races earlier on, or the late breaking races earlier on, and vice versa, then I think the story everyone would be talking about now, when we're starting to get there, is how Georgia apparently flipped or is in the process of flipping from red to blue. That's a huge story. There was a great piece by Victoria McGrain in the Globe that was digging into how that happened. There are, the whole question of assuming that Biden does win, as now he seems likely to, what is the coalition of voters that made it possible for that to happen? What allowed him to retake Wisconsin and Michigan, two states where there's very strong conservative sentiment? Those are, it's not quite as much of a meta-narrative as who are these Trump voters, and it doesn't give the press the opportunity to, masochistically rake ourselves over the coals for things we got wrong. But they're really important stories. So that's what I think we should be doing in the coming days.
Look, as to the polls, I think, polls are important. It gives both the public in general and the media something to focus on in terms of testing the temperature of the campaign. Without that, how could you tell how the campaign is doing? Who are the people who are the front runners, right? So I think it is important. But I've had several conversations with people who said that they ought to just throw out the polls, or the media should no longer rely on the polls. I'm not in that camp. I don't say that you stop reporting on the polls. I know it's a formula. I know it's easy to help you tell the story of the day, but I don't think you should throw it out. What I do think should be done is don't rely so heavily on polls. It seems as if every single newscaster in an election cycle has to begin with the polls tonight show so-and-so is up, or the polls show a steep decline for so-and-so. Include polls when you think it's necessary to convey something about the story or about the politics of the moment, but don't use it as a crutch the way we have been using it. Polls will be wrong from time to time. People don't, it's only as reliable as the people who are giving the information. And much like weather forecasters, we like to know what's going on in the day, so you can carry an umbrella or carry a sweater if it's going to be cool. But sometimes the sun is shining and it's hot and, it doesn't rain. So it doesn't mean you should throw out the forecast. So just ratchet it back a little bit in terms of how often we're forcing it on the public and on our audiences.
Yeah, really, this topic we're discussing is the oldest post-election story cliche in the book. It's right up there with holiday traffic. And if you don't believe me, Google Dewey beats Truman, 1948. Okay? Yeah, the polls are almost always off in some important ways, and we all start wringing our hands about polls. Why don't we just get down to brass tacks and either slap a warning label on all polls and stories about polls, like they do on a pack of cigarettes, that, using these can make you sick?
It's called a margin of error. We do slap a warning on it.
Yeah, but it's in teeny tiny type, and that's not what people talk about. Or, even better, both the media, as Dan just pointed out, and the consumers themselves, news consumers, just step up and take a little more responsibility for ingesting this material responsibly. You've got to understand that, first of all, if you just relied on polls to tell you what was happening with Latino voter attitudes, then you were just doing a lazy, superficial effort to find out the information. There was plenty of excellent political reporting about the inroads Trump was making with his attacks on Maduro down in Venezuela, on some other issues, small business, entrepreneurship, social value issues. The same deal with African-American men. So, buyer beware, consumer and media, wake up and be a little more energetic about this.
I think a lot of people don't really get polls. I think they don't realize that polls are a snapshot in time, and the results depend on who they reach. If you poll only people who are using a computer method, you miss out on all the people who don't answer polls via email or online. If you do only during work hours, you miss the people who are at the office. If you only do cell phone polling, you miss the people who have a landline. But I also think that people tend to think of polls as the test results rather than a snapshot in time, and that they're valid for when they were taken, not necessarily when they run. But there's also this habit of looking at voter blocks as monoliths, that all Latino voters are thinking the same thing, that all Black voters are thinking the same thing, that all women are thinking the same thing. And they're not monoliths. There's a huge difference between being Black and from the Bronx and being Black and from the Bayou. There's a huge difference between people who are Latino from certain parts of Latin America and people who are Hispanic, who are not from Latin America, may have a different mindset, different priorities. So I think we need to read some of the more in-depth reporting, broadcast some of the more in-depth reporting, and rely a little bit less on what the snapshot in time was 2 weeks ago, and then all of us end up being surprised and stunned that things weren't quite now the way they were then.